So we're in week 5 of our series that we've called The Way of Jesus, looking at how we're to live as followers of Jesus. That the Christian life and the Christian is not meant to be someone who pays intellectual assent to ideas, believes things necessarily, but a Christian is someone who is an apprentice of the Rabbi Jesus and learns to live his rhythms in the world. Each week we have kind of postcards and take-home notes that are on the table at the back, including a wonderful set of notes that David Nichols has put together for us on temptation. But the whole series that we're walking through is essentially looking at this idea of spiritual formation. How do we change? How are we made into the image of Jesus? How do we grow? And I love what the author, it's not a Christian book, but the author James Clear writes in his book Atomic Habits. He says, "We don't rise to the level of our goals, we fall to the level of our systems or habits." We don't rise to the level of our goals, we fall to the level of our habits or systems. You may have grand ideas about what you want your life to be and who you want to become. Here's the big idea, here's the news. Sorry to burst your bubble. It doesn't matter what goal you have, if you haven't got the right habits or systems in place, you'll never reach it. Every athlete who goes to the Olympics has the same goal, but only those with the right habits or disciplines in place reach the goal that they're looking for. How you're living right now is deciding for you your destiny and the legacy that you're going to leave in the world, whether for good or for bad. We might also say that you are as close to God today as you choose to be. He has made himself available and invited you to know him and given you a way of being and living in the world, and you're as close to him as you want to. In all of this, the deciding factor for us, if we're honest, isn't the desire. The desire is willing. It's the diary. The diary is weak. The desire is willing, but the diary is weak. And what we said in the last few weeks is that what's in the diary gets done. So put something in the diary. And I set you all some homework last week. Do you remember? I told you to take 15 minutes at some point in your week and try to sit in silence before God and enjoy a period of solitude and silence. We did it together in our service last week. I wonder how many of you did that. I won't be asking for your hands to raise who's done their homework. There is no marking, but nevertheless, what's in the diary gets done. Today, however, we are going to be considering some of the challenges that we face to find peace and contentment. And we're going to be exploring some of the causes of those challenges, and we're going to be asking the question, if there was a simple practice that you could put into place in your life that would drastically enrich your life and freedom and mental health, but would restrict and limit some of your time and what you do with it, would you take it? If there was a simple practice that you could put in place that would drastically enrich your life and improve your mental health, but would limit and restrict some of your freedoms and your time, would you take it? That's the question. We're going to be looking together at the way of Sabbath, the way of Sabbath. And we're going to read this morning from Luke's Gospel, chapter 6, verses 1 to 15. On a Sabbath, when Jesus was going through the grain fields, his disciples plucked and ate some ears of corn, rubbing them in their hands. But some of the Pharisees said, "Why are you doing what's not lawful to do on the Sabbath?" And Jesus answered them, "Have you not read what David did when he was hungry, and those who were with him? How he entered the house of God and took and ate the bread of presence, which is not lawful for anyone but the priests to eat, and he gave it to those who were with him." And Jesus said to them, "The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." On another Sabbath, he entered the synagogue and was teaching, and a man was there whose right hand was withered, and the scribes and the Pharisees watched him to see whether he would heal on the Sabbath, so that they might find a reason to accuse him. But he knew what was in their hearts, their thoughts, and so he said to the man with the withered hand, "Come and stand here." And he rose and stood there. And Jesus said to them, "I ask you, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to destroy it?" And after looking around at them, he said to him, "Stretch out your hand." And he did so, and his hand was restored. But they, the Pharisees, were filled with fury and discussed with one another what they might do to Jesus. This is God's word. Now, in that reading, we come across the third and the fourth mention of Sabbaths in Luke's gospel. And if you're new to Christianity, you might be wondering, what on earth is a Sabbath? Well, the Sabbath comes in at number 4 of the top 10, the 10 commandments that God gives as a summary in the Old Testament for his law. Honor or keep the Sabbath. I can't even remember, I didn't write it down. Keep the Sabbath, essentially. Number 4. It's always reassuring when the preacher doesn't even know the 10 commandments off by heart. A Sabbath in the Jewish law and tradition is one out of every 7 days, usually the Saturday, that's made different from all the other days by observing a period of enforced rhythms of rest and community and worship. It's a Saturday, one of the 7 days, made different from all the other days of the week by enforced rhythms of rest, community, and worship. And in this reading, Jesus offends the Sabbath rules of his day. Number 1, because he allows his disciples to do so-called work by taking some corn, rubbing it together, and eating it. And number 2, by healing someone who was sick on the Sabbath, which is considered work again. The Pharisees in our reading are annoyed at Jesus for breaking the rules, but they're annoyed at him not just because they're opposed to a 7-day NHS, but because of the rules that Jesus is breaking. But they're not just annoyed that he's breaking some arbitrary, mundane rules. They are worried and concerned about the safety of their community. Let me explain. The Pharisees was a religious group that grew up in the years preceding Jesus that had the core conviction that many of the historic challenges that the Jews had in their recent history were because they, as the people of God, did not obey God's laws. And so, if you know anything about Jewish history before Jesus, for a period of about 400 years, the Jews were subject to various empires trampling through their nation and carrying them off as slaves. In the past 150, 200 years or so, they've had their land back, but they're now occupied by the Romans. And before that, they were occupied by the Greeks. And before that, the Persians and the Assyrians. There are people who know what it is to be slaves, to be oppressed and to be trampled on by other empires and nations insisting on coming into their land and treating it as their own. So the Jews have lived through centuries of heartbreak. And upon returning to their land, they came to the conviction that the reason all of that had happened is because we didn't keep God's law. So we're going to keep God's law properly now. We're going to do our best to observe every rule that God gives us. And so they developed communities of worship called synagogues, where they would meet every week for teaching from the law of God so that they could learn to obey God's law. And the Pharisees would then create itemized lists of things that they had to do to ensure they were keeping God's law. And it sounds laborious, and it was, but the heart behind it was, we want to be safe and secure as God's people. We don't want war and violence. So when Jesus comes along and seems to play fast and loose with their Sabbath traditions, the real concern here is, hang on, mate, if you do that, trouble's going to follow. The Romans are going to oppress us and take us down again. We don't want that. Understanding that's important, I think. Otherwise, their reaction looks a little bit over the top. They discussed a way that they might get rid of Jesus. But because he broke a rule on the Sabbath, let's kill him. No, it's because they're concerned about their safety. Jesus' reply to the Pharisees, he says, the Son of Man, referring to himself, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. And Mark's gospel unpacks that further to us, where Jesus says, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. In other words, having one day off out of every 7 is a gift of God for humanity. It's not as though God had the Sabbath and thought, I need to create some people to enjoy this thing called Sabbath. No, he created people and thought, you should observe a Sabbath. It would be good for you, for reasons we'll come on to. The question for today as followers of Jesus, and some of you might be sat there wondering this already, do Christians have to observe the Sabbath? Do Christians have to take one day off out of every 7? Or another question might be, is the Sabbath a Saturday or a Sunday? Good questions. It's often pointed out that in all Jesus' teaching, he restates the 10 Commandments in the Old Testament and then repurposes them for his day. So he says to them, listing some of the 10 Commandments, you have heard it said, thou shalt not murder. 10 Commandment. But I say to you, anyone who's angry with his brother or calls his brother fool is punishable and guilty. Or he says, you've heard it said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you, anyone who even looks at another person with lustful intent has already committed adultery in their hearts. So he takes the Old Testament 10 commandments and he restates them. He does that with all of the 10, except the rule about the Sabbath. Instead, what he says in Matthew chapter 11, in verse 28, something that's familiar to us, to many of us, Jesus says, in a section on the Sabbath, he says, if anyone is weary or heavy laden, let them come to me and they will find rest. Jesus says, essentially, I am your Sabbath. And we observe Sabbath rest by abiding in him. So no, it is not a moral or religious duty for you to have a day off once a week. You don't have to observe the Sabbath. However, just as that's true of the Sabbath, you could say that's true of all the laws in the Old Testament. That as Christians, we don't have to keep any of the law since we're not approved by the law, but by faith in Jesus. As Christians, our relationship with the law, however, is one that recognizes the law is given not for our approval, but for our good. It would be strange to say, I don't have to not murder, or I don't have to not commit adultery, I don't have to not steal. I'm free, I can do what I want. It's the same with the Sabbath. I don't have to obey Sabbath. In fact, better than that, I can know Sabbath rest every time I come to Jesus. But in understanding the Sabbath and why it's good for us as Christians, I want to there are 3 reasons why the Sabbath was given in the Old Testament, which I want to just look at briefly. The first, that's familiar to many of us, is that in Genesis, the origin story in Genesis is that God created the world in 6 days, and on the 7th he rested. So he says this is a creation pattern, work for 6, rest for 1. That's a reason that's given for the Sabbath that many of us are familiar with. But the second reason that's given for the Sabbath in Deuteronomy 5, he says, remember you were slaves, and as slaves you weren't ever allowed a day off. Now you're not slaves, have a day off. So they were told, have a day off once a week to remind yourselves, A, you're not slaves, and B, God is not Pharaoh. You're not slaves and devotees of a tyrannical master. God, this is outrageous. Like, God is a God who insists, have a day off. What kind of boss does that? Have a day off once a week. Just rest. But the third reason, and those 2 reasons might be familiar for us. The third reason I think is fascinating. In the Old Testament, in Exodus 23, it says this. For 6 years you are to sow your fields and harvest the crops, but during the 7th year let the land lie unplowed and unused. Then the poor among your people may get food from it, and the wild animals may eat what's left. Do the same with your vineyard and your olive grove. 6 days do your work, but on the 7th day do not work, so that your ox and donkey may rest. And so the slave born in your household and the foreigner living among you may be refreshed. So the third reason that's given for a day off once a week is for refreshment. Because of creation pattern, take a day off once a week. Because you're not a slave, take a day off, at least one day off a week. And to be refreshed, take a day off once a week. Do we have to take Sabbath? No. But you get to, because God is good. If you're married, you don't have to kiss your wife. You get to. You don't have to kiss your husband. You get to. As a Christian, you don't have to take a day off. You get to. And now I want to look at our need for a Sabbath and why it is that as followers of Jesus, we ought to fight tooth and nail for this. You don't have to have a Sabbath, but you might well need to. In 1901, an American doctor coined a new term or an illness that he described, or he coined the term, the word for it was New Yorkitis. New Yorkitis, which he said is an illness of which symptoms include edginess, quick movements, and impulsiveness. And he says this is a disease which affects a large percentage of the inhabitants of Manhattan Island. Well, it's clear that disease was never contained to New York, but went global in what is perhaps an unnoticed pandemic, to the point that we all suffer from New Yorkitis. And the reason for that is that human beings, we love speed. We want fast internet, we want fast cars, we want fast food, we want fast delivery services. In fact, we think speed equals good and slow equals bad. We call unintelligent people slow. The original BlackBerry, do you remember BlackBerries? The original BlackBerry slogan was, anything worth doing is worth doing fast, which is perhaps why they went out of business so quickly. The British writer, Robert Colville, he said that he thinks we're living through what he calls the Great Acceleration. Apparently, people talk faster than they did in the 1950s. And in just 20 years, they've observed that people walk 10% faster in cities. I notice it when I watch a film with my kids. We'll sit down for a family film night, and I want to show them a film from my childhood, a classic like Jaws or E.T. or Indiana Jones. Jaws? We haven't shown them Jaws yet, but I'd like to. But my point isn't about Jaws. Amy would like to clarify, we haven't shown our children Jaws. But my point was going to be, if you'd let me finish, okay? I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that last bit. My point is that our kids don't let us watch those films because within 5 or 10 minutes, they're bored because they're so slow. You watch a kid's film now, it's action, 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 action all the time. Personally, I love a good slow drama where nothing happens. Character pieces. Downton Abbey, season 1, the best one. Nothing happened. They just talked and you just watched. It was lovely. This is why we never get to decide on what we're going to watch as films. So family film night is basically you watch what you want, I'll watch the first 5 minutes and then take it as a chance to sleep. That's how it goes. And then they take photos of me while I'm asleep and draw on them anyway. But when it comes to speed or activity, the writer and speaker Corrie ten Boom once said that if the devil can't make you sin, he'll make you busy. To which John Mark Comer adds, both sin and busyness have the exact same effect. They cut off your connection to God, to other people, and even to your own soul. The author Tom Wright says that it is only when we slow down our lives that we can catch up with God. You know, Jesus came to save the world, and he took a day off every 6 days. How inefficient is the use of his time? For 3 years, he ministered and taught, and he took a day off once a week. Dr. Koyama, in his book, The 3 Mile Per Hour God, he said, if we want to connect with God, it would be wise to travel at God's speed. So, do you want to connect with God? Do you go too fast to connect with God? Do you want your devotion to God to be like your Amazon Prime? Do you want your prayer life to be like your fast food? Now, it's not just busyness that's a problem. Many of us would say, I don't feel that busy. So it's not just busyness, but it's bombardment that's an issue. One person talks about the fact that we are bombarded with what they call a fire hydrant of information every day. The university professor said this, picture reading an 85-page newspaper. In 1986, if you added up all the information being blasted at the average human being, TV, radio, and reading, it amounted to 40 newspapers worth of information every day. That was in 1986. By 2007, they found that it had risen to the equivalent of 174 newspapers per day, bombarded at your brains, and you're expected to take some or all of it in. And here's why it makes us stressed out and is a problem or is harmful for our brains. Adam Ghazali, a neurology professor, he said this, you should think of your brain as like a nightclub, where standing at the front of the club is a bouncer, and the bouncer's job is to filter out most of the stimuli hitting you on any given moment, the noise, the sounds, and the smells, so that you can then think coherently and focus on one thing at a time. The bouncer is crucial to filter out irrelevant information so you can get stuff done. And that bouncer in your head is strong and ripped. He can fight off 2, 4, maybe even 6 people trying to barge into your brain at a time. But today, that bouncer is besieged like never before. He's exhausted. And so a lot more is fighting its way past him into your mind, interfering with your flow of thoughts. Before long, the nightclub becomes rowdy, full of people who shouldn't be there, disrupting the normal dancing. And then he says, we can ignore them and pretend that we're able to cope with everything and do everything that we'd wish, or we can acknowledge them and we can learn to live our lives in a better way. Live our lives in a better way. The way of Jesus, the way of Sabbath rest. You don't have to keep a Sabbath, but you may well need to. But here's why keeping a Sabbath is hard work. Why having a day of rest is actually really hard. See, the real obstacle to Sabbath rest, a day off every 6, 1 in 7, you know what I mean. The real obstacle to that isn't your boss or your kids or your church. It's you. As humans, we hate to accept limitations. We want to believe that we're like God. Number 2, we also we want to rest, we want to calm down, but we can't because we hate to accept limitations. But also those things, being busy, having a full to-do list, the overload of information, speed, those things is enjoyable. We like it. We're glutton for it. There's not just busyness and high-speed activities. There are other things that we do. Actually, I should say, when you do those things, you're busy, you've got a lot of information, you're fast, rushing around, those things, they are like a high-intensity, high-energy hit of the chemical dopamine. It gives you a high-energy hit of the chemical dopamine in your brains, and dopamine is the pleasure chemical. It's what helps you get out of bed in the morning. Dopamine, so you wake up and think, I managed to get out. When you're low in dopamine, you've got troubles with dopamine, you struggle to get out of bed. But dopamine is what you get whenever you do something pleasurable. And different activities give you different intensities and hits of dopamine into your brain. Other high-intense dopamine activities in our lives: loud music, taking risks, eating fatty or fast food, being competitive, playing video games, bright colors even gives you an intense hit of dopamine. And the bright colors one surprised me. So for a while I turned my phone to black and white. We'll come to that in a bit, Jace. For a while I turned my phone to black and white so that I could become less addicted to my phone, because my name's Jez and I'm an addict to my phone. But turning your phone to black and white is so boring for your brain because there's no colors in it. It becomes like so hard to look at it. That's what I found. Anyway, that's colors, and we'll come on to my issues in a bit. Now, high dopamine stimulation and impulses, whilst enjoyable, stresses your brain. And over time, it kills off brain cells. This then leads to the challenges in concentration that many of us are aware of. Last week I said that I was borderline ADD, attention deficit disorder, to which someone said, there's nothing borderline about that. What I meant was undiagnosed. We'll come on to that. Anyway, when we become dependent and used to high-intensity hits of dopamine, it reduces our ability to concentrate on normal life activities because they are, quote, boring in comparison to the other things that we do. And so we need more intense, higher stress activities to stimulate our brains. I have 3 boys. It's not uncommon to see one of them in the lounge sat on his phone, or the TV's on in the background and music playing through Alexa, while the other 2 are wrestling on the floor. All of them high-intensity dopamine-releasing activities that are enjoyable but stress the brain. I learned recently that it's not uncommon either for iGeners, this generation of people in their 20s, to watch TV with subtitles on so they can take in the information faster and have it on in the background, and then look at another device in front of them to hold their attention. That's not uncommon. Someone's shamefully going, yes, that's me. Because we've become so in need of high dopamine releasing activities that we find other activities that are slower dopamine releasing activities boring. And the condition of having a restricted or limited dopamine function in your brain is a condition familiar to us. It's known as ADHD or ADD, attention deficit disorder. And attention deficit disorder doesn't mean that you can't concentrate on things, because kids who've got ADHD can sit and watch video games and TV for hours on end. They haven't got a problem with attention. It's that they need high, intense dopamine-releasing activities to occupy their attention. And in Britain, for every child in 1986 diagnosed with ADD, there are 100 diagnosed with it today. And between 1998 and 2004, the amount of kids given stimulants doubled. Why is all of this relevant for conversation and talk about the Sabbath? This is why we find Sabbath rest so hard, but it's also a case for why we need it so much. Now, I know in trying to talk about dopamine and brains, etc., I am talking way above my pay grade. Fair enough. What do I know about the brain? So let me quote someone who does know something about the brain. Dr. Sami Timimi, who's a leading child psychologist in Britain. He's a psychiatrist, in Britain. He says this, that the vast majority of cases of kids with attention problems that come into his office, if he listens carefully to them and offers practical support to help change the child's environment, this almost always reduces or ends the problems that they have. He offers them practical support to change their environment. The way of Jesus, the way of Sabbath. I kind of say all this because I believe that the gift of Sabbath is a large part of what we need to rediscover and learn and to practice again as followers of the way of Jesus. We need this for ourselves, but we also need it for our kids. As parents, our job is to set rhythms in the home that will shape and develop the characters of our children as adults. So I don't know what this could look like for you. A day of rest and refreshment. A Yes Day, if you're familiar with that film. Yes Day is a film for kids, where kids are given a day where they can do whatever they want. Their parents say yes. Well, I think adults need a weekly Yes Day. A day of rest and refreshment where you do whatever you want. A Christmas day once a week. You know, a song, I wish it could be Christmas every day. As a kid, I used to sing that with so much feeling. I wish it could be Christmas every day. Well, you might not be able to have it every day, but you can have it every week. It's yours as an offer from Jesus, the Sabbath rest. To observe a weekly Sabbath, though, we need to think practically about a few things. The first is that you need to decide ahead of time which is going to be a day of refreshment for you. If you don't put it in the diary, it doesn't get done. And because people work kind of odd shift patterns, you need to look ahead and think, where am I going to observe it? Historically, the Sabbath has always been a Saturday, not a Sunday. Sunday is always the first day of the week. And Christians in the Roman Empire used to have to get up and go to church before work or after work to worship, because Saturday is the day of rest, the day of downtime. But whenever it is, you need to decide a day in the week for you. You need to then, secondly, you need to prepare for that day. If you're going fast, you can't stop suddenly. You need to stop slowly. You need to pump the brakes. Otherwise you crash, your wheels lock up. If you're traveling fast, you need a day to prepare for a rest day. A lot of people have 2 days off next to each other in the week. One of those days traditionally, typically, was a day for not work, but housework, so that you can have a day of rest. A few years ago, when I was starting to try to suggest to Amy that I'd really like us to, as a family, make a day of rest a special day and significant day of refreshment for us. She quite rightly said, but it's hard to rest when the house is a mess. So I've learned, if I want our family to have a rest day, I need to put in some yardage the day before so that the house is restful, so that we can actually have a down day to be refreshed. How am I doing on that? When you're preparing for Christmas Day, you don't just wake up on Christmas morning, but like, it's Christmas! We've got to get some presents. You prepare for it. You get ready for it. And I would argue that as a Christian, your rhythms ought to follow that. that you're looking forward to a day of rest, and refreshment, community, and worship, and so you find a day to prepare for it as well. The day of Sabbath, the day of refreshment, has always typically begun the night before as well. The Jews would observe it on sundown of the Friday evening. If you're observing a Sunday, then say it begins on Saturday, etc. For us, often it looks like on a Friday, or Saturday for us is our kind of day where we try to just stop and be refreshed. I try to just avoid anything to do with church. No offense, but because it's my job. For me, this is a day of rest. And so if you try to contact me on a Saturday about church, forgive me if I don't answer my phone or reply. But that's my day to be refreshed in God. What that means is that on Friday, I'm kind of doing some house stuff and doing some church bits as I can. I'll often bake some bread, I know. Sounds like Little House on a Prairie. I bake some bread so that when the kids come home from school, there's warm bread, comes out of the oven, the smells fill the house, and they complain if I do it in wholemeal, so I've got to do white bread because they're sugar addicts like the rest of us. We would then have pizza together as a family. We'll light a candle. In fact, my friends bought me this little Jewish candle holder, and so we light them, and because, why not? We stare at the candles. And I got to be honest with you, I'm with Jason. Jason's with me on this, I know. I love candles. They are just to help calm the mood. Anyway, too many side notes. We light the candle, and then we go around the table, each of us saying something that we're thankful for from the day or the week. We pray. Often we'll go for a night walk in the dark, or we'll play family games together, or a family film I'll sleep through. And then on Saturday, if I had my choice, an ideal Saturday, I'd just sit and stare at a wall, or not a wall, the creation. I'd just sit and stare into the garden, or read the Gospels, maybe go for a walk, see friends. Often we're back and forth from football, so that's not always ideal. But I try as often as I can to create an ideal day. In an ideal Saturday, I wouldn't drive, or I wouldn't shop. I'd remind myself I'm not a consumer. There's an old African proverb that says, I need time for my soul to catch up with my body. I take a day where I remind myself and ground myself in the world. I'm a creature, I'm not God. I'm not just a producer or a consumer, I'm a worshiper. And also, let me just show you this. This is a magic trick that would really transform your day off, okay? I don't know how your phone works, but most phones have a button. If you press them, these ones, you have to press two buttons together. Look at this. I can turn it off. Oh my goodness. That right there, that is amazing. And I can't tell you what happens when I turn my phone off. It's like my brain goes, and rest. I dare you to have a day a week where you turn your phone off. Sometimes my family tell me off, not my family who live away, tell me off. What if we need to contact you on a Saturday? And I say to them, you can't. Or my friends might say to me, what do we do if we need to contact you on a Saturday? I'm like, come and knock on my house. Let's pretend it's the 1990s. Let's pretend we're living back then in the Stone Age before we all had these midget demons in our pockets that would just terrorize us. Now, that's an ideal day. I've got to be honest with you. It's rare I have the strength to do that for a day. I turn it off and then I turn it back on because I'll find some reason. I need to listen to music, some fast music because I'm an addict to intense activities or whatever. Or actually, Amy always has her phone on, so you can always contact her on a Saturday. Now, we also, in our house, we have a poster on the wall that I've put up with a list of slow dopamine-releasing activities. Because there's a list of fast dopamine activities, but there's this list as well of slow dopamine-releasing activities. Things like eating healthy food, or getting plenty of rest and sleep, arts and crafts or coloring, imaginative creative play, playing music, sunshine, protein, going for a walk in the woods, all these sorts of things, slow-releasing dopamine activities that help balance your brain's addiction to high dopamine stimulation out. And I just submit to you that a day a week like that would help put some rhythms and things into your brain that will do you good, restore you. Now, I know this is hard, and I know that we don't live with ideals. And if you're on your own, the idea of a day of rest and refreshment on your own isn't necessarily the ideal either. So Sabbath has often been a day for community, eating dinner with friends on Sabbath day, using a Sunday to just worship and be refreshed in God. I don't know what it looks like for you, but I know it's important. Now, all of this isn't new. You know, if you've been alive for longer than, 30 or 40 years, you'll remember when Sabbath, Sunday, was insisted upon in our nation. So it's not new, but the best or most important things in life rarely are new. The funny or tragic thing, depending on which way you look at it, the funny or tragic thing is that in our nation, we used to really appreciate this. At the King's Jubilee, I don't know when that was, but at the King's Jubilee, George V gave out booklets to everybody in the nation about what it is that makes Great Britain great. This is a picture of the booklet that he gave out. It was given to me by a friend who received it from someone in his church. And everybody in the country was given this booklet, The Royal Way, a souvenir of the King's Jubilee. In it, it asks the question, what makes Great Britain great? The answer is this. From the time of Alfred the Great, the Ten Commandments and the Sabbath, a God-given day of rest, has been observed. And then it says this, His Majesty the King fully recognizes the value to the community of keeping Sunday as a day of rest and worship. It then includes quotes from men like Winston Churchill and a leading doctor in the nation at the time. And Winston Churchill, in fact, calls the Sabbath rest the birthright of every British subject. And there are pages devoted then on how to keep the Sabbath because they saw how beneficial it was. That's within many of your lifetimes. And so if you were there and you received that, imagine how strange it must feel to live in a society like this, a constantly on society. Not in a pursuit of community well-being, but in the pursuit of capitalism and commercial gain. Now, if I were to ask those of you who were alive when this booklet was given out, or others, if you wanted to return to an age in England where the Sunday was practiced and observed, you'd probably say absolutely not. Because I know, speaking to some of you, I would quickly get stories of meaningless rules and restrictions, no laughing, no fun, no dancing, no this, no that. In fact, when we moved into Seaford, our neighbour, as far as I know it, has never been to church. She told us off one week for playing cricket in the garden on a Sunday because she said, it's a Sunday. And that was news to me. Like, oh, so cricket, I think cricket's bad anyway, but you can't play it on a Sunday? Fine, I don't mind. Anyway, shouldn't have offended the cricket fans. So, the way of Jesus involves the way of Sabbath. And the reason that's important, I'm going to hammer this enough, is because it changes the way you think about yourself, and it changes the way you think about reality. And it reminds you, you are not God, and you need a Savior. And Jesus says, come to me, I'll give you rest. Sabbaths in the Gospels were always a battleground for Jesus. Just a quick glance through sees that he had some of his sharpest confrontations on Sabbaths. In Luke's Gospel, I mentioned that we got our third and fourth mention of the Sabbath here. There's two more mentions of Sabbath with different conflicts, and then there's one more mention of Sabbath, 7 for a week. And the seventh mention of the Sabbath in the Gospel of Luke is on Sunday, the first day of the new week. See, Jesus fought battles on 6 days. And on the seventh day, after having been crucified on the eve of the seventh Sabbath, he was then resurrected to new life. And this is the best news in the world. Jesus fought battles for rest, on days of rest, against the demons and tyrannies of this world that would want to keep you busy and active and fruitless. You may earn a lot of money. You may work so hard till your eyes bleed. You're so stressed. And you may make money and have a big house to show for it. But you're disconnected from your soul, from your community, from God. Jesus fought the battles for you and rose to new life on a new Sabbath day, a new Sunday. And now he's able to take all of our striving, all of our angst, all of our restlessness, so that we can come to him at any time and receive his peace and his victory over the tyrannies of this world. Friends, let's observe the way of Sabbath. Let's pray.